Well, I haven't made a video in a while, and because I've been pretty busy, but there was a little brief article making the rounds on Facebook, at least on my friends, and I thought that I would read parts of it and give it a little critique. You'll see what it's about as soon as I start to read it. Also, I hope the sound is okay. I am at work. It's not as noisy as it sometimes is, but there still might be some background. Maybe quite a bit. We'll see when I'm done. Okay. Quote, there are roughly 200 nations to which you could emigrate. They are the product of an anarcho-capitalist free market. There is no over-government dictating to those sovereign nations. Indeed, the only difference between the anarchy of the nations and libertopia is that anarcho-capitalists are wishing for a smaller granularity. These nations have found that it is most cost efficient to defend themselves territorially. End quote. There's two more paragraphs, but I want to do them one at a time. First, they are the product of an anarcho-capitalist free market. This is palpably false. Free markets, capitalism, as far as libertarians define it, require voluntary transaction. Every government in the world has its borders set based on conquest, even if it wasn't the conquest of that particular government. So it may be true that Mali did not wage wars to exactly carve out its border, but France did, and then France just arbitrarily gave borders to Mali. There aren't any nations that have borders that weren't based on coercion or aggression. All the little Polynesian nations, they were conquered by Europeans and then just given fake governments. They are not the result of market transactions whatsoever, not defined by anybody, including even socialists. I don't see how they could say, you know, Attila the Hun or Genghis Khan were free market capitalists. I don't know. There is no over-government dictating those sovereign nations. This is correct. There are certainly people in the world who want there to be an over-government and who are working towards one, but there is not one right now, and I don't know if there ever will be one. It seems like there are systemic reasons why that would be very difficult to actually achieve, but that is correct. Indeed, the only difference between the anarchy of nations and libertopia is that anarcho-capitalists are wishing for a smaller granularity. Not necessarily. Libertarians tend to not idealize a certain size of market actor. So there are exceptions to this. There are libertarians who think that we should all do everything at home and be localists, and that every company should be no bigger than a mom and pop, but they're a minority. Most, especially if they're Rothbardians, and it's not just Rothbardians, but especially if they are, think that the market should set the size of market organizations, firms, basically. And that means that sometimes, in all likelihood, in some industries, there's probably going to be a huge diffusion just because physical reality and entrepreneurship dictate that, and there are others likely will be much larger and perhaps even single companies. And in certain situations, there has to be a monopoly. For instance, if there is a good or service that can only exist in one spot or from one provider, then that's by definition a monopoly. A good example here would be like Brad Pitt. There is only one Brad Pitt. Now, there are other good-looking actors, there are other good-looking actresses, that they can compete with him in the sense that they provide something, just in the same way that hot air balloons and motorcycles compete with automobiles. But there's only one Brad Pitt, so you can say, well, he's a monopoly. But there's other things. There are certain resources that are extremely scarce, or perhaps only available in one specific location, and so you might only have one firm there. But there's no normative reason to have things be a certain size, whether that be big or little. So this person is not quite sure what they're talking about. All right. These nations have found that it is most cost-efficient to defend themselves territorially. Now here he's kind of, whoever wrote this is conflating nations and government and states in a way that's actually kind of hard to think about. Because if you look at, say, any country in the world, any nation-state in the world, you draw a line around its borders, it is guaranteed even in micro states like Micronesia or the Vatican City. Well, maybe not the Vatican City, but like Malta or Monaco, it is almost guaranteed. It's guaranteed that some of the people in that society do not agree with some aspect of the government, either how it was formed or how it's run, let alone how it defends itself. As such, it becomes difficult to claim that these nations found it most cost effective. All right, if this is akin to saying Americans decided that it was most cost effective to overthrow the Mohammed Mossadegh in Iran, or to support the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, or to support the Ikhwan and the Saud family in Saudi Arabia. The vast majority of Americans not only had no part in that decision making, but when those decisions were made, were completely unaware that any of those things even existed. And so to say that those nations have found to do this and that without qualifying the fact that most of the people in the nation either had no say or no knowledge, or both in most cases, it's very unclear. So what they probably mean here is the states. But then this is kind of defeating the argument. If they're making an argument in favor of states, and then they cite the preferences of states, that doesn't make any sense. That's using circular reasoning. That's to say, it would be like saying the Catholic Church should have the right to do whatever it wants, and the reason is the Catholic Church has found that doing whatever it wants is the most efficient way to do things. That's circular reasoning. So if they mean states here, that's circular reasoning. If they mean nations as a more general society as a whole, then it's not true, because how can people who are ignorant or have no direct or even indirect influence on those decisions be said to have chosen to do that? They can't. If any other market provided 200 choices, libertarians would declare that the sacred workings of the market blessed whatever choices were offered. Okay, there's two things here. One is the characterization of libertarians as having, or libertarianism as being a religious ideology. This is not true. Libertarians are very often a-religious. Many of them are atheists or agnostic, and the ones who are religious have a particular faith, usually Christianity, although there certainly are Jewish and Muslim ones as well. And to those, couching libertarianism in religious terms would be some kind of blasphemy or whatever. So libertarians do not believe in the market or freedom or libertarianism on religious grounds. Now, it is true that there's a great deal of respect and awe towards religious workings, just as evolutionary biologists might praise the workings of evolution, but that doesn't mean that they worship Charles Darwin or that they worship the market. This is coming from people who do not understand what they're talking about, as is made clear by their statements in this very brief segment. And so it seems that when they see people so fervently in favor of something that they don't understand, or at least don't want to understand, that they perceive that as being religious dogma, when of course it's not. People are not born libertarians. I have never actually met somebody who was raised a libertarian. I've never met somebody who said, hey, both my parents were Rothbardians and we read Mises around the dinner table, and I've never ever met anybody like that. All of them are people who came to it in either young adulthood or adulthood, and I mean like in their teens. I don't know any 10 and under, any 12 or under. I've never even heard of them. I've seen a few 15, 16-year-olds. That's about it. So this is not something that it's a dogma you're born with. People develop this as a philosophy from any number of possible angles. A religious one is not. The other one, if in any other market provided 200 choices, again, I don't know any libertarians who have a number that they think is a satisfactory or unsatisfactory number of choices. The other thing is there's no choice here. You don't get to choose how many countries there are, or which ones you live in, or which ones lord over you. The point is that the choice choices do exist. It's up to libertarians to show that there's something wrong with the market of nations in a way that would accept being applied to markets without nations. Yes, that's very easy. The market, the free market, as libertarians envision it, as they advocate, is one that lacks coercion, that lacks, or that does, at the very least, strives to achieve a lack of coercion. All libertarians understand that there's still going to be theft and rape and murder. There's still going to be coercion. But what they can say is, but what we shouldn't do is advocate or promote institutions that are predicated on those wrongs. That's no way to get rid of the problem. That's just codifying the problem and sustaining it forever, basically. The nations that exist today were formed by the sword, and they are maintained by the sword. Sometimes, some of the nations aren't maintained by their own swords. They're maintained by other swords, like Kuwait. Kuwait did not conquer the land area of Kuwait. The British did, and then the Americans defend it now. All right, so it's not the Kuwaiti swords, it's other swords, and there's lots of countries like that. The more powerful ones, the big ones, they were built on their own swords, or their own government swords, rather. Libertarians don't want societies to be built that way or to be run that way. That's the problem with it. Okay. Libertaria is a combination of values that just doesn't exist. The government equivalent to a really posh residence for very little money. Again, this is kind of not very clear writing. I'm not sure what exactly they're trying to say. You can find nations which have much lower taxes. Just don't expect them to be first class. Again, define first class. I beg to differ. There are states that have enormously high taxes. They're not necessarily any better. There are states that have enormously more regulations. Here's the other problem here that shows us people don't quite understand what they're talking about. I don't know any libertarians who think that the extent of government involvement in the economy is dictated by their tax rates. We pretty much all understand that is just one segment of government intrusion into the economy. For some reason, it's one of those topics that is in mainstream political discourse. So Republicans talk about taxes, libertarians talk about taxes, so anti-libertarians pretty much figure if they attack taxation, they are attacking libertarianism. When in fact, libertarians are also against a whole slew of other things that Republicans are not, which are not generally part of political discourse. Massive deregulation is not a mainstream political cause, and so whoever has written this is not really aware of it apparently, and this is significant because that makes all the world of difference between how well the economy functions. We can find plenty of examples of states with low taxes, including the United States, for a long time, where you have phenomenal growth, enormous economic wealth, and the uplifting of literally tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of people out of and away from poverty to wealth. And to say that there's a correlation with higher taxes and first class is absurd. The only way you could come to that conclusion is if you just syllogistically define first class to mean as long as the government's doing the things I want, then it's first class, and that's the only standard. So this is like the people who say any country that doesn't have universal health care is automatically below any country that does. Any country that doesn't have universal college education is automatically behind those that do, and then they can define it in a way that, oh, look, the countries that they want to emulate the most are the best, and all others are not. Now, unfortunately, values are subjective. They vary from individual. There's no basis to consider any of those values normative, let alone ranking them as first class. There are any number of other rubrics we might choose by which your choices can not only change, but they can become completely the opposite. So Scandinavia has really super high suicide rates, so obviously they're not that great. The people tend to have a lower disposable income, they tend to live in smaller places, they tend to eat less meat, blah, 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 blah. I'm not saying that these automatically are normative values, I'm just saying we can create a scale by which they're not great. And so, yeah, if they want to go by that, okay. And the reasons these combinations don't exist is probably simple. The free market of government. Of course, there is no free market in government. Services essentially guarantees that there is no such thing as a free lunch libertarians want. It's not competitive. Okay, libertarians do not want a free lunch. This is the mischaracterization here. The idea when people say they don't want the government to do X or anything at all for that matter, the assumption is, oh, so you just assume that they're either not be goods and services the government provides, or you just want those goods and services for free. This is, of course, stupid. Libertarians don't say this at all. Libertarians think that if you have a good and service, that in order for that to be provided for you, you have to get the person who provides it to you to do so voluntarily, which in most cases is going to require some kind of mutually satisfactory exchange. Not they have to give it to you as your right. This is what socialists think. Socialists like to think that they get free lunch, free healthcare, free school, free unemployment, free whatever. They think of it as free. They're too stupid to realize that it's not, and they're too amoral to think of it as wrong. This is exactly the opposite of what libertarians believe. And of course, there's the fallacy here. It's so old. Bastiat wrote about it even, and he was not the first, I'm sure. He said, you know, if we say we don't want the government to nationalize all the farms, then we're accused of saying that we don't want there to be grain and everyone to starve to death. No, they just want the market to handle that. We don't want the government to run schools or roads or defense. It depends on the libertarian you ask to, or the courts. There are problems with all those, both in how the government provides them, in that they can provide them in an abusive way, and because they can provide them in a less than satisfactory way, and because they can provide them in an overly expensive, wasteful way. And there is no reason to assume or to conclude that those things cannot be provided, not only at all, but far better on the market. That's why we think we don't want a free run, free lunch. All right, so there's that. Now, I actually just read another similar one that says it was about the social contract. I don't have it in front of me, so I'm not going to read it. That said basically the social contract is valid because, and I got this from the website, Libertarianism Sucks or Government is Good, one of those two sham websites. Anyway, the argument basically went, you're born into society, it provides you goods and services, and if you want to leave, you can, you're free to leave, and the fact that you don't leave, that proves that you consent to the social contract and to be taxed and all that, so you are not, taxation is not theft. I am actually sure I read that on the Government is Good website under the heading taxes. This is missing one critical point here. And the omission is either one of they don't want to believe it, or they're too stupid to believe it, or they're intellectually dishonest and refuse to see it. There's two problems with this as I see. One is that it misses one crucial element. You are not free to leave your state or go to another state, ever. All right? It's not like I can call my cable company and say, I'm done, cancel me. All states set entrance and exit requirements. Now, they vary what they are. In East Germany, the exit requirement was they would kill you. You weren't allowed to leave under any circumstances. They built a wall around Berlin. I don't think the entire country literally had a wall. The Soviet Union was the same way. The United States has very large punitive taxes on anybody who leaves. So, even if you've supposedly paid all your taxes up until that point, and now you're going to leave, and since you're going to leave, you're not going to be paying for any more government services, right? Like, let's say I pay taxes, and that's supposedly for services, even though that's silly. It doesn't really work out, because you never get a bill for how many times you drove on the road, or how many times you went to the DMV, or how many times you went to public school. You never get a bill for that, ever. They just arbitrarily set a bill, and you're supposed to pay it. But let's just assume you do all that, and you decide, well, I just paid, it's April 17th, I paid what I owe the government, and I am out of here. I'm leaving to go to another country. Since you have no debt to the country, even by its own rubric, you should be able to go. Wrong. The government, in the case of the United States, and other governments as well, although not always to the same degree, will say, no, you have to do X, Y, and Z as well. So the problem with this theoretical framework by which we get to freely choose countries is that the terms of changing allegiance are unilateral, and they are set by the state. So the state can say, yeah, you can leave, but you have to leave X amount of your property. And it could be all your property, it could be half, it could be 10%, it could be whatever. And since this is the case, you are not free to choose at all. you are subject to the whim, because again, it's not negotiated. You don't get to go to the government and listen, you know, I liked it while it was last. It was a good relationship, but you know, it didn't work out, and I really want to live in the Bahamas now. So can I please go? You don't get to then negotiate how much you get to pay. They get to negotiate, and if you don't do what they say, then they will be punitive against you. Now, you might be able to escape. There are people who manage to leave countries without paying anything. Maybe they don't have any landed property. Maybe they're sly enough to hide it in a way that the state's unaware that it's there, or unable to find it even if they knew it was there. But that's not the typical case, and that's not what these people are arguing. These people are pretending that the states freely allow people to go when they clearly do not. And the states also don't allow people to freely enter. You cannot just turn up in Switzerland and say, I want to live here now. The Swiss government will say, no, no, no. And the U.S. government will say, you didn't pay your taxes. And of course, this is coming up with this Eduardo Saverin, a very attractive co-founder or whatever, CFO of Facebook, who they're considering landing punitive additional taxes on. And so I wonder if all these idiots who say, oh, you're free to choose, do they read all this stuff about the Facebook guy and they change their opinions and be like, wait a second, yeah, we believe in government, yeah, we believe in taxes, but if this guy wants to leave, that's fine, he should be free to choose. Did the guy who makes the Government is Great website, did he write an article like that? No, he didn't, because he doesn't care about that. He thinks the government should be able to set whatever standards it wants. Now, the other problem here with this love it or leave it argument, and there's more to it. I've heard that a lot of people who ask to have their citizenship revoked are just denied, either for no reason or for stupid reasons. So there is no love it or leave it argument. They say, you're pound of flesh, and we decide what the pound of flesh is, or nothing, or it's total punitive imprisonment, all the guns in the room, all that stuff. Now, the other problem is the people who believe in this do not equally apply it. All right, by the rubric set out where you're born, your parents sign your Social Security or whatever, the state gives you services, any state that ever exists, no matter how tyrannical, will meet that criteria and then hence be justified in whatever it does. So East Germany was not wrong, okay? It had people, they were born in East Germany, or they were there when East Germany became a country, and they were taxed for services that they received, like being spied on all the time by their neighbors and everything, and being forced labor camps and all that, and going to prison and whatever, all those great services. And the government set the price for leaving as you would have to basically run a gauntlet of barbed wire, dogs, machine gun nests, and walls. And if you managed to get past all that, then they would confiscate all of your belongings and persecute and prosecute anybody who they thought was either your friend or family that you left behind. So they're perfectly justified in doing that because they're the government and they get to decide what it costs to leave. And so Soviet Union, Communist China, the United States, all this stuff with Saverin, all this stuff falls within the purview of being perfectly okay. Now, do these government as good people, do they explicitly endorse all these governments? I don't think so, but by their own logic, they're fine. The other thing is non-government agencies or organizations that act in this identical way are not going to be viewed as being legitimate, even though they logically match exactly what they're talking about. For instance, let's say that, to take a very real life example, your family as members to a religious sect, let's say the Mormons or Warren Jeffs or the Branch Davidians, and their adherence to this religion, when you are born, they sign you over to the great leader, whether it's David Koresh or Warren Jeffs or Brigham Young or whoever, and that you are their property. Now, the reason is, hey, you're a ward of your parents, they have a right to do this, fine. Let's ignore for right now the parent-child relationship and what makes sense there and what doesn't, and let's just assume that's okay. Let's say you grow up, you don't like being a ward of the cult leader or the religious sect or the company for that matter, to bring up something that these statists would find to be very dystopian. Let's say someone like the Truman Show, who was owned by a corporation. Let's say you decide you don't like it anymore and you want to leave. Well, you don't just get to leave because Warren Jeffs might say, or David Koresh or whoever might say, fine, you can leave and all your property, that belongs to me now. Your slave master could say, okay, you don't want to live on my plantation? Well, all your life savings, I get to keep those, I get to keep your house, and your family, they don't get to leave, and if you do leave, I might just decide to whip them horrendously. for all the goods and services I provide them, like healthcare and free housing and education to the extent that I deem it's necessary. Now, would the government as good people, would they say, oh, that's fine, as long as they give them the choice and say, you pay this price, you're allowed to go, that's fine? No, they don't. And then the other problem here, a third one, is it begs the question, where did this government get its legitimacy in the first place? Again, as I pointed out at the very beginning, never is there a unanimous consent of all the people supposedly governed in the country that the government A, exist, B, work in a certain way. Certainly not in the United States. In the case of the United States, you have people who come over here as individuals, not as a government, and they come, and some of them stole land from the Indians explicitly, like they'd show up and they'd plunder a village and build a town there. Most of them didn't actually do that, not because they weren't racist and not because they were nice, but because there weren't all that many Indians to be robbed at that point. Maybe there were 100 years before, but they all died of smallpox or whatever. Yeah, some European guy will come, build a little farm in the middle of the Shenandoah Valley or some other place, or Massachusetts or Connecticut, and he owns that farm. He built it with his own hands, locking in property rights. He hasn't hurt anybody. He's converted something into something that's more valuable to him, and if he ever engages in voluntary exchanges, he's also increased the value of everybody he exchanges with. So it's a win-win-win-win-win situation. Then one day he just hears that the United States government exists, and he's a citizen of it, and they have a tax on whiskey or whatever. Or they won't allow him to help slaves escape from other people. How did the U.S. government suddenly get this authority over him? He wasn't born in the United States in this case. He didn't sign anything. In all likelihood, he didn't vote. And again, some people did vote, but the government decides who gets to vote and what they get to vote on. So the initial legitimacy is not clear at all. It would be clear if there was unanimity, I would agree. If everybody in the entire United States got together and said, we all agree to this, these are the terms of the contract, there is a social contract, it's explicit, here it is, it's the Constitution, we agree with it, fine. All those people, yes. Their children, no. New immigrants, no. They didn't sign it, the legitimacy isn't there. But that's just some theoretical, hypothetically possible but never actually happened scenario, because it's certainly not what happened in the United States, and it's not what happened in any other country ever. The governments that are popular acclaim, they were popularly acclaimed by some mob in some capital city or some political party or some ethnic group. Not everybody who they pretend to govern and rule or seek to govern and rule. And so there is no. So what these arguments really boil down to is a hypocritical endorsement of the status quo. Whatever exists, it has to be legitimate, and here's some excuse why. Even though that excuse why would hypothetically then excuse all kinds of slavery. Sure, you can have a slave, and if the slave wants to leave, all you have to do is say, oh, well, sure, you can leave, and I'll keep all your property. And then you'll be homeless and totally destitute and poor. And then if the slave doesn't run away, then that proves that the slave isn't a slave, but is just there voluntarily and everything's fine. And anybody who thinks that he's being wronged is a crazy religious fanatic who believes in, some god called the market. No, it just means that it's a coerced position because the slave doesn't get to set the terms of his release. The slave doesn't get to say, I'm done, and here, all the stuff that I made, that I earned, that I created, I'm taking that with me. Slaves don't get to do that, and so they're being coerced, all right? And you don't get to go to the U.S. government and say, we're done, I'm taking all my stuff with me. Never mind the fact that your land, or your home, what's their basis for them owning that? They just asserted it explicitly. The United States, the government formed, and over the territory it claimed, it just asserted itself, whether people wanted it or even knew it existed or not. And then they went through an explicit phase of deliberate conquest of the type most liberal socialists would condemn. And yet they view that as a perfectly valid foundation for what we have today. And it's not like the United States is the weird example here. All the borders you see on the map can be traced that way. Or the government's there. I mean, you could look at Palau and be like, oh, Palau's an island and its borders are determined by the Pacific Ocean. Fine. All right, but the government of Palau is there because the U.S. Navy decided they needed to have some kind of some kind of cooperation with the natives there before they blew up the island with nuclear bombs. That wasn't Nauru. That was any number of other atolls. But like, those governments were appointed by the sword by another government that was itself based on conquest. They never ever come about by some popular acclaim of certainly not a unanimous acclaim of some populace. It's never ever happened. And so to pretend that that's what they're based on is just sheer delusion or ignorance, maybe both. So I find this absolutely utterly unconvincing, and what I see here is a group of people who worship the government, who believe in it absolutely, who get warm, fuzzy feelings at the idea of an intrusive government that can do whatever it wants. They're completely blind to its failings. When they do see its failings, which are undeniable, even the most socialist person knows this or that thing the government has done that they think is wrong. They just imagine if only it worked the way I want it to be, everything would be fine. When it does things that other people think are terrible, but it doesn't, then all of a sudden their values aren't egalitarian at all. The things they value are normative, and they have a right to enforce those values on those poor people who have the pretense to think otherwise. And then they hear these libertarians saying that the government is bad, that the government is evil, that the government is stupid and wasteful and unnecessary, and they just have a conniption fit. They can't take it, and they don't study libertarianism, they don't learn about it, they don't confront logic, and then they create these nice sounding rhetorical frilly arguments as to why the state's good they just fail because they're not true. You don't get to set the terms. You're not free to choose the terms of your expatriation. You're not. The government sets them unilaterally. It's not a negotiation. Now, do they all set the same terms? No. Do those terms change? Yes, and they can change in a minute. This is happening to Eduardo Saverin right now. They're just saying, oh, you know what, fuck him. Even though, what the fuck does he owe? He's helped in some way, and of course there's controversies how, but he helped create something that millions and millions of people place great value in, and that has become a part of their lives. What does he owe? How does he incur a debt for that? That's the other thing, is when I engage in a transaction with party A or B, how does C come in and say, now you owe me because you two got along? That's fucking bullshit. Where does the debt come in there? And the debt by C is not there's no logic to it. It's completely arbitrary. It's whatever the hell C says it is. C, the government. It's whatever the government says it is. Your tax debt is whatever the government says it is. It has nothing to do with services. It's nothing to do with how much you use the things they claim to need to exist for at all. It's completely arbitrary. And so to characterize it like, oh, if you don't like it, then you can just leave. It's fucking bullshit. It's not even true. It's obviously not true. Call the government and ask, can I just stop being a citizen and leave whenever I want? And they'll say, oh yeah, of course, here, of course. No, they won't. That's not even a claim. And yet the people come out, have the gall to accuse libertarians of being dogmatic religious fanatics and being idiots and using condescending tones in their writing and how they speak. Just read The Government is a Good website. You'll see exactly what I'm talking about. When they have a huge logical hole, a huge blind spot to reality. And it's fucking stupid, and it pisses me off. So, that's it.